So Zusa, the floor is yours. I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video feed. Please tell us about the vulnerable teacher.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris. I certainly feel very vulnerable right now, knowing that there are so many of you there listening. Anyway, thank you very much for joining the session. As it is way easier for me to express myself in writing, I actually put my thoughts down on paper, and now I'm going to read them to you. I'll try to do it slowly, and I hope that you won't be overly bored. So the opening sentence to 2016 study entitled "The Vulnerability of Teaching and Learning in a Selfie Society" reads, "To be human is to be vulnerable." The statement, it seems, has recently taken on a new meaning. The current pandemic exposes our vulnerability as both individuals and societies, simultaneously enhancing divisions among socioeconomic lines and cutting across all demographics. In Poland, schools have become a no man's land between the virus and the governmental restrictions, with teachers often feeling like cannon fodder. The following presentation, however, is not so much a reflection on the present-day global crisis, although it may have been triggered by it, as it is a deliberation on vulnerability inscribed within the experience of teaching per se. I am, therefore, going to focus on the specific kind of experience and exposure and wavering that I feel when I face my students. The liminal space between my desire to be liked and my wish to be respected. A question that should be asked, I believe, is how to incorporate effective teaching within this space. Drawing on the fact that our motto is "from the heart," I have taken the liberty to organize my considerations around my personal experiences as a learner and a teacher, in hopes that other learners and teachers can relate to them too. My first memorable experience of vulnerability happened at school. The year was, quite tellingly, 1984, and the school was a random public primary school in a big industrial city. The day before the momentous event, I and my friend were engaged in bad-mouthing our tutor in front of her classroom. Even though we were 8 and manipulated into conformity, we enjoyed this minor act of subversion. Unluckily, we were also overheard by another student who reported it back to the teacher in question. In communist Poland, both bitching and snitching were common ways to get by. The next morning at 8 o'clock, once we were all seated and ready for a math lesson, the teacher requested that I come to the front of the classroom and face my classmates. As a very good student, I must have thought she would have me demonstrate solving a mathematical equation. Instead, however, she ordered the whole class to stand up, point their fingers at me, and reiterate the word traitor, time after time after time. I remember standing there for what seemed like ages, shame manifest on my red, sweaty face, and seeing my best friend's accusatory finger aimed at me like a gun barrel. My interest in vulnerability and shame became academic many years after that, when another teacher asked me what I felt. He was a university professor who, unlike myself, had a clue about what I should do with my life. He fancied himself a collegiate superhero, saving disoriented girls with postgraduate studies, and wanted me to write a PhD on whatever was close to my heart. "What are you feeling right now?" he asked, boring into me. Since shame was the only answer I could muster, I spent the next 4 years exploring the nature of the affect. It was also around that time that vulnerability became a trending subject in the academe, which was marked by the publication of Judith Butler's Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence in 2004. Although in the experiences I have described so far, vulnerability and shame seem inextricably linked, they have been in fact theorized as markedly distinctive. In the simplest of terms, shame is usually seen as an emotion which precludes connection to others, because it is a direct blow to your sense of self and makes you feel unworthy of such connection. Although it commonly appears when we are caught doing something that is considered unacceptable, shame is not about what we did, but rather about who we are. Brené Brown, a professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, who researches both vulnerability and shame, uses the metaphor of gremlins to talk about the latter. The American movie entitled Gremlins, which was released coincidentally in 1984, tells of small evil creatures that multiply expeditiously when they come in touch with water or eat something after midnight and die when exposed to light. Building on the creature's viciousness, Brown compares shame to the gremlin that says things like, quote, "You're not smart enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not worthy, your spouse left you because you are worthless, you never get the promotion because you have no skills, etc." unquote. In more academic terms, the angst inscribed in the experience of shame is that of losing face, in which the fundamental "who am I" becomes inevitable. Even though Brown asserts that there is no transformative potential to shame, that is, that there is no research that would prove that shame or shaming can motivate a person to act or change or develop, I would not brush it off so quickly. As far back as 1956, Jean-Paul Sartre suggested that the affect may be conceived of as a realization of an intimate relation of oneself to oneself. Through shame, he said, "I have discovered an aspect of my being." Sally Armand sees shame as a variegated emotion with effects and practices that are not necessarily negative. Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick has focused on the transformative nature of the affect. Shame does, after all, subvert our supposedly stable selves. On a similar note, feminist theorists advance that shame is an experience which may create bonds between women. What connects them in shame, a unique version of the affect which Uliana Lehtinen calls the underdog's shame, is shared vulnerability to its effects. The women, the researcher says, the researcher says, there is seemingly no possibility of defying the feeling. I feel connected to other women, which is why I feel another woman's shame. As much as it is not my intention to equate the two concepts, I believe that vulnerability is always inscribed within the experience of shame and is similarly contagious. Whereas, however, I cannot imagine shame without vulnerability, I believe that vulnerability does not necessarily presuppose shame. That being said, it is commonly defined in negative terms as our propensity to be easily hurt physically, emotionally, and mentally, and likened to susceptibility, weakness, and lack. Be that as it may, I imagine vulnerability as an opening to harm, but possibly to other things too. On a similar note, Jim Burns traces the origin of vulnerability to the Latin vulnerare, meaning to wound. Drawing on Parker Palmer's The Courage to Teach, exploring the inner landscape of a teacher's life, and Brené Brown's work, however, he then redefines the concept as, and I quote, a courageous transformational path towards a more authentic way of being, unquote. The word courage, as Palmer notices, derives from the Latin cor, meaning heart, a place, quote, where all of our ways of knowing converge. Intellectual, emotional, sensory, intuitive, imaginative, experiential, relational, and bodily, among others, unquote. This is in this center place called the heart that our vulnerability dwells. I had little awareness of this center place at the beginning of my teaching career and had met very few vulnerable teachers. The university I studied at was a feudal institution with inbuilt hierarchies and strict rules to follow, almost like a church. The higher you were on the institutional ladder, the bigger distance you felt from those down below. My teachers were often brilliant and their behavior very polished, but their teaching rarely relied on building a sense of connection with their students. They were the shepherds, we were the flock. They did teach me many important things about the world, but one of the things I learned on the side was that I could never be as good as them. The feeling did not pass once I started working at this very institution. Partly, this was because the university had me teach a whole range of subjects I honestly knew little about. I taught courses in American and British literatures, whereas my area of relative expertise was Canadian studies, and partly because of the raging imposter syndrome. Truth be told, I have never in my life felt sufficiently prepared for any class I taught. How I dreaded inquisitive students. When asked an unwelcome follow-up question, I froze and often said something irrelevant, but complicated, in a vain attempt to save my face at all costs. I felt no connection to my students. I felt no connection to the students I taught. I mostly gave lectures, which meant little interaction, to large groups that in my mind blurred into indefinite judgmental mass. Every yawn I accidentally spotted, every hushed conversation in the back rows felt like a deliberate personal insult. I was so insecure that it was difficult for me to maintain physical balance, which is why I sometimes resorted to sitting and reading from my notes. I felt vulnerable, and I felt my vulnerability exposed for everyone to see, which made me feel deeply ashamed. At this stage of my life as a teacher, vulnerability and shame indeed felt like one and the same thing. As I stood in front of my students then, most of my effort went into saving my face, which I always felt on the verge of losing. In other words, my focus was invariably on me, not my students. I used to think that it changed quite radically once I started teaching outside of the university walls, and particularly as regards my one-to-ones. With some of them, it seemed to me, I formed very close, almost intimate relationships, and I learned so much about them. They would tell me repeatedly that they loved our classes and they requested that I be their only teacher. I felt positively grateful. I felt so grateful, in fact, that I stopped teaching them anything, lest it would interfere with our sweet time together. I remember one student specifically who spent 60 minutes telling me about his marital problems to the rhythm of my nodding head. I did not interrupt. He was, after all, speaking English. Once his time was up, he said, "Thank you, Zuza. This has been a wonderful conversation. No one has ever given me better advice." Although giving students the floor felt very different from lecturing them, the relationship was again one-sided. I felt less exposed, obviously, because I barely participated in the classes, but my focus was still on protecting my self-esteem and being liked no matter what. Let me tell you, it did not work as a teaching strategy. One by one, the students simply stopped coming. At some point, they must have realized that what they actually had paid for were English lessons and not unprofessional therapy sessions. Importantly, neither at the university nor during my one-to-ones did I ever consciously use vulnerability as a resource. On the contrary, I kept collecting evidence that vulnerability is adverse to the teaching process. At one point, for instance, I had a student who was severely anorexic. For personal reasons, I immediately felt deeply connected to her and started fantasizing about saving her life. I fell head over heels into what Jim Burns calls the myth of the heroic teachers, in which idealized pedagogues fix marginalized students. We developed a personal connection on the fundament of my vulnerability. The girl was responsive, grateful, and soon enrolled in my BA seminar. In the following months, it became very clear to me, however, that she was not going to be my girl Friday, that is, indebted and compliant. Enmeshed in her disorder, she did not want to follow my or anybody's lead. Instead, she checked me on how much I was actually ready to do in order to help her. Was I ready to be her friend? Was I ready to answer her phone calls in the middle of the night? Was I ready to let her write her diploma thesis on the harmful properties of fat? I most certainly was not. Our relationship grew sour over time as I tiptoed my way out of it. As this story implies, and as the authors of The Vulnerability of Teaching and Learning rightly assert, students and teachers are complex human beings engaging one another in processes that have societal implications beyond the classroom. For this reason, vulnerabilities experienced by them often transgress their shared experience of being human, as well as their roles of students and teachers, and become linked to their personal stories and a variety of identity markers, such as their nationality, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, etc. By means of another example, over the past month, in the midst of the pandemic, there have been ongoing anti-governmental demonstrations in Polish streets, triggered by the decision made by the country's constitutional tribunal to further tighten abortion laws. On national TV, the protesters have been repeatedly blamed for spreading the virus and hence for the growing number of cases and deaths, as well as for stirring social unrest. The protesting women have been called ugly, disgusting, vulgar, and crazy by conservative politicians, and compared to murderous witches and Satan's daughters by some more radical ones. Whereas the majority of the Polish society declare their support for the strike, these invectives have been replicated and memified countless times, and thus have become part of our public discourse. It is in this cultural and political context that I taught a class on feminist theory to a group of young men who clearly had no prior experience with literary or cultural studies. They had, however, developed very strong and highly stereotypical opinions about women, repeating the dominant ideas of what constitutes a normal woman, and even quoting some of the far-right politicians. What made things worse for me and easier for them was that it was an online lesson and they all had their cameras off. 15 minutes in, I was being mansplained by mostly anonymous male voices. Should I have risked exposing my vulnerability to them, knowing that it could open me up to violence? Should I have behaved like a good or at least normal woman and passed their comments over in silence? Was teaching them something even an option? The vulnerable teacher, as all of these experiences suggest, walks on a very slippery ground. In order to teach effectively, they have to maintain a level of hierarchy and a degree of distance between themselves and their students, and yet risk opening up, which may be very difficult to balance out. Vulnerability, described as a courageous transformational path, does not translate into yielding to your students' terms, clowning to make them laugh, or belittling yourself in any way. In order for it to work to your benefit as a teacher, it has to stem from your sense of agency, integrity, and groundedness, which I personally do not always feel I have. Therefore, I have developed a habit of practicing my vulnerability in situations in which I feel safe. Fortunately, after 22 years of teaching, I feel safe as a teacher more often than not. As an illustration, I answer, "I do not know," whenever I cannot find an answer to a question. I also promise to check it out, and most of the times I do. When I see back row students chatting incessantly, I stop teaching, face them, and tell them that they are making it really difficult for me to focus. Sometimes I reveal to my students that I failed my practical English exam after my first year of studies. It is, in fact, a really good story, which involves a fortune teller wearing a turban, which somehow makes it less embarrassing to tell. These ideas are in line with what other vulnerable teachers say. Being vulnerable with students, in Shannon Haddy's terms, quote, requires that we let down our guard to show the shortcomings and struggles that require us to keep growing and learning. Otherwise, we create an ideal persona that gives students the perception that they must be perfect in order to achieve, unquote. The researcher also classifies the use of humor, enthusiasm, and passion for the topic as elements of vulnerability. Carol Dweck's work, and again I quote, demonstrates that a willingness to accept failure and mistakes as part of the learning process leads people, including students, to much greater successes. Teaching our students well includes teaching them that the failures are not barriers to success. When we are willing to be vulnerable and imperfect, we help students feel safe enough to also be imperfect, and thus take the risks necessary to grow in our classroom, unquote. Ellen Watson, in turn, stresses the fact that vulnerability, and another quotation, is a reciprocated experience thanks to which the teacher may be able to empathize with the struggling or confused student, to rethink their teaching approach of this content, or to find a place of understanding from which to guide learners, unquote. Whereas practicing vulnerability through developing habits seems crucial for effective teaching, what is perhaps even more important when looking for this place of understanding that Watson writes about, or the courageous place of the heart that Palmer ponders, is the spontaneous exercise of the quality. This happens when I am tuned into whatever is going on in the classroom and react with empathy and attentiveness to what my students say. To make it possible, I try to remember that most of them feel vulnerable for the very same reasons I do. Namely, they also feel visible, exposed, observed, and evaluated in the classroom. They enter the classroom space with their own preconceptions about teachers. One of them being that I am, in fact, the man and have the power to fail them and hence possibly even change the course of their lives. Many of them have experienced shaming at school. Sharing stories of vulnerability with them helps me to foster a generous dialogue situated in lived experience, which in turn leads to the creation of relationships as safe spaces. To sum up, the vulnerable teacher who verbalizes their vulnerability to connect to their students better becomes a tender narrator, to use Olga Tokarczuk's phrasing. In fact, Tokarczuk's understanding of tenderness converges with my intuition on vulnerability, as both can be defined, and I quote from Tokarczuk, as deep emotional concerns about another being, its fragility, its unique nature, and its lack of immunity to suffering and the effects of time. They both perceive the bonds that connect us, the similarities and sameness between us, unquote. Although neither one seems to befit the collective trepidation that we have been experiencing recently, the immediate impulse being to toughen up and to save yourself, it is perhaps now more than ever that we need to find courage to be vulnerable, tender, and kind, both in the classroom and outside of it. When you create a safe space for narrating stories of what you once experienced as shameful, shame disappears. If shame gremlins, as Brené Brown suggests, die when exposed to light, perhaps we should start imagining vulnerability as this very light. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Zuza. That was really fascinating, and judging by the chat, which is pretty full of long comments, actually, certainly one that resonated. Since we have a few minutes, if anyone has any questions, I'd be very happy to read them to Zuza. Yeah, there seems to have really hit home for a lot of people, and what you said struck a chord with me, especially. What made you decide that this would be your topic today?
I mean, you may remember, Chris, that when you first approached me, we had a very different idea for my presentation, right? I mean, I think that we were considering me kind of talking about using English to teach maybe American literature, or just to teach some of the academic subjects, right, that I teach. But then I think that, well, perhaps I just sort of asked myself, like, what actually feels close to heart for me right now, and it was definitely vulnerability, right? And again, this was still the time when we taught face to face, and it just seemed particularly relevant, right? I mean, again, the students, I really like my students, right? But again, at the same time, I felt like, well, you know, here is this sort of virus, right, going around, and here I am sort of, you know, pretending, right, to kind of like, you know, like this sort of the shields. I don't think that they kind of, you know, work. So yeah, I felt vulnerable also for this reason, right? But again, right, of course, like in this presentation, I only focused on the relationship between the teacher and the students, but there is so much more to it, right? I mean, what also makes me vulnerable is being observed, right? Being appraised, and like, you know, like this is also the sort of these are definitely, right, the situations which are part of my work, right, and make me feel very, very vulnerable.
Oh,
right?
absolutely. I mean, with observations, I always feel as if I've worked so hard to establish an identity for myself as a teacher. Here comes another person to watch. And then I'm thinking to myself, okay, basically, I have to ask permission to continue in this identity. Am I good enough to still be this thing? It really shakes you to your foundations, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, Valentine says, don't start me with observations. Absolutely. Yeah. A teacher of mine back in England when I was 18 or 19 and professing a sense that I would want to become a teacher myself, he gave me one line of advice. He said, no smiles till Christmas. Have you ever heard anything like that? That kind of goes in with something Valentine said in the comments, I think, which was this idea of not putting too much of yourself out there until you've already built up some sort of a relationship with the students. Because if you put the relationship with the student first and you develop rapport, then you've fall prey to the sort of situation that you've described, where you put the teaching second and the relationship first, and we can see the consequences there. And then Sandy says, no smiles to Christmas is horrible advice. I've never been able to do it myself, Sandy, although I've toyed with the idea, certainly with some of my teen classes when they seem not to be, quite focused enough, perhaps. Yeah, but a balance is something definitely to be struck. I think maybe this no smiles to Christmas thing is something that maybe belongs on the pages of literature rather than life. Wow. So thank you again, Zuza. This has been a really interesting presentation. I have to say, I was a little bit concerned when I heard that there would be no PowerPoint. I was like, with no PowerPoint, how do we, I don't know, pay attention? But I think that wasn't a problem for us. Judging by the comments, paying attention was certainly not a problem for anybody. You had us there.